Okay, let's just dive right in. Picture the scene with us. It is Tuesday, January 27, 2026.
Hmm?
And we are looking at a headline that, I mean, it feels like it's been in the making for, well, basically our entire adult lives. The breaking news is flashing across the terminal. India and the European Union have just concluded a comprehensive economic partnership.
It's a massive moment. I mean, genuinely historic. And I think the date is crucial here. We're sitting in 2026, looking back at a process that has been stop, start, breakdown, restart for literally decades. But
Yeah.
today, the ink is dry.
Exactly. And I think for a lot of people, and maybe you're one of them, when you hear trade deal, your eyes kind of glaze over.
Sure.
You think, okay, great, maybe French wine gets a little cheaper, or
Right.
maybe those German luxury cars get a slightly better price tag.
Right, the usual suspects.
And sure, that's part of it. We all like cheaper wine. But we have this master brief in front of us today. And what it's telling us very clearly is that if you think this is just about tariffs or wine or cars, you are missing the entire point.
Completely.
Okay.
I mean, if you just look at the scope of these documents, the sheer density of what has been agreed to here, calling it a simple trade deal almost feels like a disservice.
It does.
This is a geo-economic partnership. It is a fundamental restructuring of how two of the world's largest democratic economies interact with each other. It's not just about buying and selling. It's about standards. It's about movement of people. It's about the future of the entire global supply chain.
So that is our mission for this deep dive. We are going to unpack this beast. We aren't just reading you the press release. We are going to dissect this master brief to understand the winners, the losers, and this really interesting concept the source keeps mentioning called creative destruction. Because this isn't just a handshake, it's an earthquake for certain industries.
It is. And to understand the magnitude of that earthquake, you have to look at the stakes on the table.
Yeah.
Just, look at the players. On one side, you have the European Union. That's a 27-country bloc. It is the world's largest single market. We are talking about 450 million consumers, and not just any consumers. These are high purchasing power consumers with extremely strict standards for quality, for safety, and for the environment.
And then on the other side, you have India, the world's fastest growing large economy, a manufacturing powerhouse, a services giant, and frankly, a country that is absolutely hungry for export-led growth.
Right. So you have these two massive forces, and for a long time, they were sort of dancing around each other, stepping on each other's toes, really. But this deal, this 2026 partnership, is the moment they decided to actually sync up their rhythms.
Okay, so let's lay out the roadmap for this deep dive.
Yeah,
We're going to start with the history. I mean, why did this fail so many times before? It's a critical question.
it really is.
Then we're going to get into what the brief calls the hidden game of non-tariff barriers, which I was surprised to learn is where the real money is made or lost.
That's where the bodies are buried, so to speak.
We'll talk about the controversial carbon taxes, the green elephant in the room, and finally, we're going to name names. We're going to talk about who makes money from this deal and who is going to have a really, really hard time adjusting.
It's a fascinating lineup, and I think the best place to start is with that context. Why now? And, maybe more importantly, why not before?
Yeah, let's unpack that because the source material uses this phrase that I really like. It says the relationship is complementary, not competitive. That sounds like something you'd see on a dating profile. What does that actually mean in plain English in an economic context?
It's a good way to put it. But it really does imply a kind of puzzle piece fit. They aren't trying to sell the same things to the same people, essentially. If you look at the fundamental economic logic found in our source, India is labor-intensive and skill-intensive.
Right.
It has a massive young workforce. It's becoming a global hub for manufacturing and, of course, services. The EU, on the other hand, is capital-intensive. It's a mature market. It has advanced technology. It has, as we said, incredibly strict standards.
So it really is like puzzle pieces. One side has the youth and the hands and the demographic dividend. The other has the capital and the market and the rule book.
Precisely. India has what the EU needs, cost-effective production, a huge pool of skilled professionals. And the EU has what India needs, a massive, wealthy market to sell to, and the technology and capital to upgrade its own industries. It's a classic symbiotic relationship on paper.
But wait a minute. If the puzzle pieces fit so perfectly, why haven't we done this sooner? The source mentions some hard numbers to establish the baseline. Even before this deal, The trade relationship was huge, right? It wasn't like they were starting from zero?
Oh, absolutely not. The baseline reality before this 2026 breakthrough was already very significant. We're talking goods trade hovering roughly between 120 and 136 billion euros annually.
That's not small change.
Not at all. The EU was consistently India's #1 or #2 trading partner, depending on the year, and you had over 6,000 EU companies already operating on the ground in India, so the commercial ties were deep.
So the foundation was there. It wasn't like two strangers meeting for the first time. They were already, heavily invested in each other.
No, the foundation was absolutely there, but the walls kept falling down every time they tried to build the second floor. It was a project that was perpetually under construction and perpetually collapsing.
And that brings us perfectly to the history of failure. Specifically, 2013. The source explicitly talks about the collapse of talks in 2013. We've been talking about this for decades. What went wrong back then? Why did they just walk away from the table?
It was a classic deadlock, a complete collision of defensive interests. You have to remember the mindset back in 2013. The EU came to the table with very specific, very aggressive demands.
Okay.
They wanted significantly lower tariffs on automobiles. They wanted to sell their cars in India without that massive import tax, which can be over 100% on some luxury cars.
Right. The German automakers have been eyeing the Indian middle class for, 20 years?
At least. And it wasn't just cars. They also wanted extremely strict intellectual property protections, specifically regarding pharmaceutical patents. This was a major, major sticking point.
And that's because India is the pharmacy of the world, right? Its whole model is based on affordable generics.
Correct. India's entire pharmaceutical export model and a huge part of its domestic healthcare system is built on producing affordable generic drugs. India saw those EU demands on patents, things like data exclusivity, and said, absolutely not.
A red line.
A bright red line. They feared that stricter patent laws would just kill the generic drug industry, drive up healthcare costs for 1 billion people, and undermine their ability to supply affordable medicine to the rest of the developing world. They saw it as an attack on their policy sovereignty.
So that's pharma. And what about the cars? What was India's logic there?
Well, very similar, really. It was about protecting a nascent domestic industry. India feared that lowering those high auto tariffs would just wipe out their own car manufacturers. At the time, Indian car makers were still maturing.
Right.
They didn't want a flood of Volkswagens and Peugeots and Renault to drown out homegrown champions like Tata and Mahindra before they'd even learn to swim in the deep end.
Okay, so India's playing defense on cars and drugs. What was India asking for that the EU said no to? It had to be a two-way street.
It was. India's big ask was all about services and people. They wanted what's known as Mode 4 service supply.
Which means?
Visa access. India wanted their professionals, their IT consultants, their engineers, their architects, to be able to travel and work in Europe more easily on short-term contracts. And the EU, which was dealing with its own internal, very fraught migration politics at the time, just said no.
So a total impasse.
A complete impasse. You had the EU wanting market access for its goods, India wanting job protection at home and mobility for its people abroad, and neither side would blink.
So it was a staring contest that lasted for 7 years, and then they just flipped the table and walked away.
Pretty much. The talks were suspended in 2013, and there was silence. For almost a decade, radio silence.
So what changed? I mean, something must have fundamentally shifted. The source mentions a pivot between 2020 and 2026. What was the catalyst that finally got everyone to sit down and say, okay, let's stop staring and start signing?
2 words, China risk.
Ah, the geopolitical elephant in the room. It always comes back to that, doesn't it?
You cannot understand this deal without understanding the geopolitical context. I mean, COVID-19 was the massive wake-up call, and the geopolitical shifts that followed really exposed the profound vulnerability of global supply chains.
Right.
The EU, in particular, had a terrifying realization. It was dangerously over-reliant on China for everything.
Yeah.
From active pharmaceutical ingredients, ironically, the very stuff they need to make medicine, to rare earth metals for their electric vehicle batteries.
The green transition they're betting on.
Exactly. They looked at their supply chain map and saw that almost all roads led to Beijing, and that scared them. It was a strategic vulnerability of the highest order.
It's the classic don't put all your eggs in one basket realization just on a continental scale.
Precisely. They needed diversification, urgently. They needed what the strategists started calling a China plus one strategy. And when you look at the map, when you ask who can be the +1, who has the scale, who has the population, who has the industrial base, and critically, who has democratic values,
It's India. There is really no other option that fits that bill at that scale.
It's India. It was the only country with the potential scale to be a credible alternative, a credible plus one.
And India needed something too, right?
Huh?
It wasn't just Europe knocking on the door, cap in hand.
No, absolutely not. India was also at a pivot point. The country's leadership realized you can't grow an economy to then $10 trillion just by selling to yourself. You need global markets. India needed a massive engine for export-led growth.
And it needed tech.
And it needed technology. It needed technology transfer to upgrade its manufacturing, to move up the value chain. So suddenly, in the wake of the pandemic, the strategic interests aligned in a way they never had before. Both sides realized that shared values democracy, a commitment to rule-based trade, actually mattered more than the individual sticking points like car tariffs or visas that had sunk the deal a decade earlier. That alignment is what paved the way for this 2026 breakthrough.
So the fear of supply chain collapse on one side and the desire for massive growth on the other essentially forced the marriage that couldn't be arranged in peacetime.
Necessity is the mother of invention, and in this case, it was the mother of a landmark trade deal.
Okay, so the motivation is crystal clear. Let's get into the meat of the deal itself. Part 2 of our deep dive. The goods, tariffs and red lines. The headline number here is staggering. The deal covers 96 to 99% of trade value.
It's incredibly ambitious. That is a very, very high ambition deal. Usually you see FTAs covering 80%, maybe 90% if they're really pushing it. Getting to 99% means they really went through the list line by line and slashed almost everything.
And it says tariffs are removed either immediately or over phases of 3 to 10 years. So let's talk about the wins. If I'm an Indian exporter, where am I popping the champagne? Or perhaps the masala chai?
Sauce. Well, looking at the list from the brief, the biggest winner, and I mean the absolute heavyweight champion of this deal for India, is undoubtedly textiles and apparel. This is massive.
Why is that one so big? I feel like we always talk about textiles, but why does this specific deal change the game so much?
Because the EU has historically had quite high tariffs on textiles. We're talking around 9% to 12% to protect its own remaining industries in places like Portugal or to favor other partners who had special status.
Like Bangladesh or Vietnam.
Exactly. Bangladesh, for example, has had duty-free access for years because of its least developed country status. India didn't have that, so an Indian-made shirt was automatically 10% more expensive than a Bangladeshi-made shirt just because of the tax at the border.
That's a huge margin in the clothing business. In many cases, that's the entire profit margin.
It is the profit margin. So for India, gaining tariff-free access to the EU market for shirts, trousers, bed linens, home textiles, that is a direct employment booster. We're talking about potentially millions of jobs in manufacturing clusters like Tirupur in the south or Surat in the west. It completely levels the playing field.
Right.
Suddenly, the Indian manufacturer can compete on quality and speed and design without having one hand tied behind their back by tariffs.
That's huge. It's not just about corporate profits. That's real jobs on the factory floor, which is a massive political win as well. What else is on the winners list for India?
Leather and footwear is another big one. Again, a highly labor-intensive sector. If you go to places like Agra or Kanpur, this is very big news. Gems and jewelry Belgium, particularly Antwerp, is a huge center for the diamond trade, so that trade lane opens up significantly.
And marine products. You mentioned shrimp earlier, which surprised me.
Oh, massive. India is one of the world's largest shrimp exporters, but it was facing tariffs and, as we'll get to, very strict checks that made it hard. Now, at least the tariff barrier is gone, which is a huge first step. And finally, engineering goods.
So, things with moving parts.
Things with moving parts. These are sectors where India is already quite strong. Things like pumps, valves, certain auto components, but the tariffs were holding them back from their full potential. Now, the gate is open.
Okay, so India gets to sell more shirts, shoes, and shrimp. What does the EU get? Where do they win? They must have finally gotten something for those cars we talked about earlier.
They did. The EU finally cracked the automobile nut. But, and this is a very big but, the source notes this is gradual. It's not an overnight floodgate opening.
So we aren't going to see a flood of German luxury cars on Indian roads tomorrow morning, pushing all the Marudis off the road.
No. It's almost certainly a phased reduction over that 10-year period. It gives Indian manufacturers time to adapt, to get more competitive. But eventually, yes, European cars will be cheaper in India.
But is that even the biggest prize for them?
I would argue it's not. More importantly for the EU, it's about auto components, high-tech machinery, and medical devices. Those high-tech, high-precision machines that Indian factories need to upgrade their own production lines. those get cheaper.
That sounds like a win-win, actually. If Indian factories need German machines to build better products to sell back to Europe, making those machines cheaper helps everyone in the long run.
Exactly. That's the complementary part of the relationship coming into play again. And of course, the classic, almost symbolic EU demand, wines and spirits.
Of course, Scotch and champagne, the diplomat's favorite subject.
Always. It was always a symbolic and economic priority for Europe. The tariffs on imported alcohol in India were astronomical. We're talking 150%. Reducing that, even partially, opens up an incredibly lucrative market for European distillers and winemakers.
But it's not a free-for-all. I have to point out what the brief calls the do not touch list. There are things that are explicitly left out, the red lines.
Correct. Every trade deal has exclusions. You can't sign a deal of this magnitude without protecting your most sensitive spots. For India, the absolute red lines were dairy and beef.
Which makes sense, given the obvious cultural and religious sensitivities around beef.
Cultural, yes, but also deeply economic. The dairy sector in India it's not like in Europe. It's basically millions and millions of small farmers, many of them women, with maybe 2 or 3 cows. It's a cooperative model, not an industrial one.
Right.
Opening that up to massive European dairy conglomerates who operate on an industrial scale,
Right.
It would have completely decimated rural livelihoods. It would have been a social and political disaster. So that remained protected.
That seems like a smart political choice. You can't sacrifice 10 million small farmers for cheaper French cheese.
Exactly. Politics matters in trade, so dairy stays out. Along with certain other sensitive agricultural products and strategic MSME sectors that the government feels just aren't ready to compete head-to-head with German efficiency yet.
Okay, so tariffs are down. 99% coverage, sounds great. But here's where it gets really, really interesting. This is the part of the master brief that made me sit up and take notice. Part 3. The real game. Non-tariff barriers, or NTBs.
This is where the amateur stops reading the press release and the professional starts taking notes.
The source basically says, and I'm paraphrasing here, tariffs get the headlines, but NTBs are where the game is actually played. Break this down for us. What on earth is a non-tariff barrier?
Think of it this way. A tariff is a tax at the border. It's a price, you pay it, you get in. It's simple math. An NTB is a standard. It's a rule, it's a gatekeeper. It says your product must meet this specific safety requirement or this environmental standard or this packaging rule, or it cannot enter no matter how much tax you're willing to pay.
So it's not about price, it's about permission. It's a yes-no question.
Exactly. It is binary. You either comply or you don't. And the EU is the undisputed world champion of standards. They have the highest, most complex standards on Earth. They have what our brief colorfully calls the acronym SOUP, primarily SPS and TBT.
Okay, let's decode the soup. This sounds incredibly boring, but I have a feeling it's incredibly dangerous for a business owner who doesn't understand it. Let's start with SPS.
SPS stands for Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures. Basically, it's all about food safety and animal and plant health.
Give me a real-world example.
Okay. Imagine you are a farmer in Maharashtra, and you're exporting a crate of the world's best Alfonso mangoes to a supermarket in Paris.
Okay, I have my crate of delicious mangoes.
Great. But the EU inspector at the port in France asks, does this mango have any trace of a fruit fly that is common in India but not in Europe? Or is there any residue of a particular pesticide that we banned in 2024? If the answer is yes, or even, I'm not sure, I don't have the paperwork, that entire crate is rejected.
Not just taxed higher, but rejected.
Rejected and very likely destroyed. You get nothing.
Wow. Okay, and TBT, what's that?
TBT is technical barriers to trade. This applies to manufactured goods. Does this children's toy have lead paint? Is this electrical plug designed to be safe for European sockets? Does this car seat meet the latest EU crash test requirement? Does this medical device have the proper CE marking to prove it's safe and effective?
I can just hear the listeners groaning. It sounds like a bureaucratic paperwork hell.
It is paperwork hell. It is a labyrinth of rules and regulations, but, and we have to clarify this to be fair, it's about safety and quality. The EU isn't doing this just to be difficult. They're doing it to protect their consumers. They don't want lead in their kids' toys. They don't want unsafe electronics. But for an Indian exporter, especially a small business used to the domestic market, this is a mountain to climb.
The source mentions the compliance reality. It talks about traceability, lab testing, certifications.
Yes. You can't just write, my product is safe, trust me, on the box. You have to prove it. You need a lab report from an accredited, certified lab. You need to be able to trace that shrimp you're exporting all the way back to the specific pond it was grown in to prove no banned antibiotics were used. You need a digital trail for every single screw in that piece of machinery.
So if I'm an Indian business owner and I see the headline 0% tariff, I might think I've won the lottery. I popped the champagne.
Yeah.
But then my container gets stuck in the port of Rotterdam for 3 months because I didn't have the right pesticide certificate for a tiny ingredient.
Precisely. 0% of zero is still zero. If you can't cross the NTB barrier, the tariff cut is completely useless. It's a trap for the unprepared.
So how does the deal solve this? Or does it? Does it just leave Indian exporters to figure out this maze on their own?
It tries to solve it. It can't eliminate the standards. The EU will never lower its safety standards, but it can reduce the friction. The FTA introduces something called mutual recognition talks. This is potentially huge.
Mutual recognition. That sounds like a diplomatic term. What does it mean for the guys selling the mangoes?
In simple terms, it means the EU starts to trust Indian systems and Indian labs. Currently, you might have to send your mango sample to a lab in Europe to get it certified, which is incredibly expensive and slow.
Right.
Mutual recognition means the EU would audit and then certify a lab in Mumbai or Delhi. So if that Indian lab says this mango is safe and meets EU standards, the EU customs officer at the border says, "Okay, I believe you, come on in."
That saves a massive amount of time and money.
Huge amounts of time and risk. They also introduce things like trusted trader programs to speed up customs clearance. If you are a company with a clean track record of compliance over several years, you get put in the green lane. You don't get stopped for a random inspection every single time.
So it's like TSA pre-check for cargo.
That is a perfect analogy. It is TSA pre-check for your shipping containers. You build up trust, you follow the rules, and you get to breeze through while others are getting their bags searched.
Okay, that's a huge piece of the puzzle. Moving on to part 4. We've talked about goods. We've talked about the incredibly complex rules for those goods. Now let's talk about people. Services. The source calls this India's critical interest.
It is. It absolutely is. You have to remember, India is a services superpower. We're talking ITs, which is information technology-enabled services consulting, engineering, accounting. This is a massive part of India's GDP. We sell brains, not just hands.
But the source makes a very, very specific distinction here that I think we need to highlight for everyone listening. It says this is not open migration.
No, and that is the most common misconception. People hear services trade, and they immediately think immigration. They think, oh, this means I can pack my bags and move to Berlin tomorrow. This deal is not about giving visas for people to move to Europe permanently and look for a job.
It's not a green card.
It's not a green card. It is about professional mobility.
Explain the difference. What does professional mobility look like in practice?
Mobility is temporary. It's specific. It's tied to a contract. Let's create a persona to make it real. Let's say we have Priya. Priya is a senior software architect working for a tech firm in Bangalore. A German automobile firm needs a specialized team to fly over and set up a new AI-powered logistics system in their factory.
All right.
They hire Priya's firm for the project. This deal makes it much easier and faster for Priya and her team to get temporary work visas to fly to Stuttgart, work on-site for 6 months or a year to finish the project, and then return to Bangalore. She doesn't have to go through the grueling general immigration lottery or the long stay visa process.
So it's about faster licensing, easier cross-border contracts. It reduces the friction of doing business across borders.
Yes. And another huge part of it is the recognition of qualifications. One of the biggest hurdles for Indian professionals historically was that an Indian chartered accountant's degree or an architect's license wasn't automatically recognized in Europe. Their degree was seen as less than or unproven.
They'd have to requalify.
Exactly, which is a huge barrier. This deal starts the formal process of mutual recognition for professional qualifications. It says, let's create a pathway so that your Indian degree actually counts in the EU.
That's a game changer for the entire Indian service industry. It legitimizes Indian education and skills in one of the world's most valuable markets.
Yeah.
But let's pivot now to something that might be a game changer in a much more challenging way. Part 5, the green elephant.
The green elephant, yes.
The CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. I love that the source calls it the green elephant because it's big, it's in the room, and you absolutely cannot ignore it. What on earth is CBAM?
Simply put, it is a carbon tax on imports. The EU has very strict carbon pricing laws for its own companies. They have an emissions trading system. If a French steel mill emits a ton of CO2, they have to pay for that pollution.
Right. It costs them money.
It costs them real money. So the French steel mill turns to Brussels and says, hey, it's not fair if we are paying for our carbon, but we have to compete with imported steel from India or China that is cheap precisely because they are polluting for free. We can't compete with that. They call it carbon leakage.
Okay. Makes sense from their perspective.
So the EU introduced CBAM to level the playing field. It says, if you want to import carbon-intensive goods into our market, and the first wave includes things like steel, cement, aluminum, and chemicals, you have to pay a tax equivalent to the carbon that was emitted during its production.
Ouch. That sounds like it hurts Indian manufacturers a lot.
It does. It hurts a lot. Many Indian steel and cement manufacturers, for example, use older, more carbon-intensive technology. They're often coal-based. This tax could make their products significantly more expensive in Europe, potentially wiping out their entire price advantage. If your steel is 10% cheaper, but the carbon tax is 15%, you lose the sale.
So isn't this just protectionism disguised as environmentalism? I know that's the argument many developing countries have been making.
That is exactly the argument you hear from New Delhi to Beijing. They call it green protectionism. But the EU's response is, no, this is about global climate action. If we don't tax your carbon at our border, you'll just keep polluting and dump the cheap, dirty goods here, and the planet loses.
So how did they resolve this? Because this sounds like another deal breaker. Obviously, the deal went through, so India didn't walk away this time.
It was a major, major friction point. The compromise they reached is really interesting. They didn't scrap the tax. The EU can't do that. It's their domestic law, and it's central to their climate goals. But the FTA creates a formal link to green transition funding.
Meaning what?
Meaning the deal earmarks a significant pool of money. We are talking about over 500 million euros to start, specifically to help Indian industries decarbonize.
So the EU is basically saying, we're going to tax you for your carbon, but here's a big pile of money to help you fix the problem so you don't have to pay the tax.
Exactly. It's a classic carrot and stick approach. Here is the tax, that's the stick, but here is the funding and, critically, technology transfer, that's the carrot. We will help you green your supply chain. It turns a potential penalty into a powerful incentive for modernization.
That phrase, technology transfer, comes up a lot in the brief.
Yeah.
It sounds like India is betting big that this deal will not just be about selling more goods, but about fundamentally upgrading the entire Indian industrial base.
That is the core strategic bet for India. It's not just about selling more, it's about becoming better at making things. This deal forces Indian industry to modernize. If you want to sell to Europe, you have to clean up your act, you have to improve your quality, you have to digitize your records. It's a forced march up the value chain.
Okay, let's get technical for a second, because this is another one of those boring-sounding things that can make or break a business. Part 6, Rules of Origin. The source calls this the technical snare. Why is this a snare?
Because this is the rule book that determines who actually gets to benefit from the tax cut. It answers the question, is your product really made in India?
Okay, give me an example.
Imagine you are a shirt manufacturer in Mumbai.
Okay, I'm back to making shirts.
You import the fabric from China because it's cheap. You import the thread from Vietnam. In your Mumbai factory, you just sew on the buttons, stitch the collar, and put it in a box. Then you ship it to France. Do you get the 0 tariff?
I would hope so. I did the final assembly in Mumbai. The tag says made in India.
Under strict rules of origin, or URO, probably not, because the value addition that happened in India was minimal. The fabric accounts for, say, 60% of the cost. The buttons are 5%. Your work was a small part of the final value.
I see.
The EU wants to give the benefit of this deal to India, not to China via India. They don't want India to just become a packaging station for Chinese goods to enter their market tariff-free. That's called transshipment, and it's a huge concern in every trade deal.
So they have these strict thresholds. You have to prove that a certain percentage of the value, say 40% or 50%, was actually created within India's borders.
Yes, and this is the snare. If the rules are too strict and the paperwork is too complex, SME, small and medium enterprises, simply can't figure them out. They don't have the sophisticated accounting software to prove exactly where every thread and every button came from.
So, as the source says, bad rules of origin, SMEs excluded.
Correct. The big multinational corporations can hire an army of consultants and lawyers to figure it out. The little guys just give up and pay the tariff, or they don't even try to export. But the source does mention cumulation provisions, which is a helpful feature.
And that is?
It allows for regional sourcing sometimes. So if India sources materials from another country that the EU also has a trade deal with, let's say South Korea, maybe that Korean input can be accumulated and counted as local for the purposes of meeting the threshold. It helps integrate regional supply chains.
Okay, so the verdict here is, it's incredibly complex. It's a detective story for every single product you export. If you can navigate it, it's an export boom. If you can't, you are left on the sidelines watching everyone else succeed.
Which leads us perfectly to the bottom line, the winners and the losers. Because in every deal this big, someone wins and someone loses.
Part 7. The source uses that great Schumpeter phrase, creative destruction.
It's the perfect description for what a deal like this does to an economy. Trade deals create enormous wealth, but they also destroy inefficiency. It's the very nature of competitive capitalism.
So let's list the winners. We've touched on some of them, but let's be specific. Who is having the best year of their lives in 2026?
Well, as we said, textile and garment clusters, a huge employment boost. If you own a garment factory in Tirupur, you are hiring people. Pharma exporters, they get reliable sourcing, easier approvals, and massive market access. IT services firms, easier movement of people means higher margins and bigger projects.
And the brief mentions the indirect winners, which I thought was a great point.
Yes, this is crucial. Think about the ecosystem, the logistics companies, the ports, the shipping lines, and of course, the testing labs.
Right. If you have to certify all these new complex standards, the product testing and certification lab business is going to absolutely boom.
Exactly. Someone has to do the testing and stamp the paperwork. The entire certification industry in India is going to see double-digit growth for a decade. It's a massive hidden winner.
And now for the difficult part. The losers. The source calls this the hard truth. Who is crying into their chai in 2026.
The hard truth is that the previously protected domestic manufacturers are in deep trouble. If you are a company that only survived because the import tax on your European competitor was 50 or 100%, you are now exposed.
Your shield is gone.
Your shield is done. You have to compete on quality and price, not just because of a government wall. If you are making substandard machinery and selling it only because the German alternative was artificially expensive, your days are numbered.
It's sink or swim time.
It is sink or swim time. Also on that list, the carbon-intensive exporters who can't or won't green their supply chain. If you can't reduce your emissions, the CBAM tax will eventually price you out of the European market entirely. And finally, the low-tech SMEs and the informal sector.
Why them specifically?
Because if you can't handle digital documentation, if you operate primarily in the cash economy, you cannot export to the EU. This deal demands formalization. It demands digital records. It demands compliance.
That's the creative destruction in action. It forces modernization. It drags the informal economy into the formal light, whether they like it or not.
It does. It can be painful in the short term for many, but it's arguably necessary for the long-term growth and maturation of the economy. It kills the chalta high attitude, the it's okay, it's good enough mindset. Good enough is not good enough for the European market.
Now let's zoom out, way out. To part 8, the geopolitical big picture. We started by saying this isn't just a trade deal, it's a geo-economic partnership. What does this mean for the world map?
It means the world is reorganizing. It's fragmenting into trusted blocks. The era of blind efficiency at all costs globalization is over. The EU is explicitly, openly reducing its dependency on China. They are hedging their bets. They are buying an insurance policy against geopolitical risk.
And India is the insurance policy.
India emerges as the trusted global supplier. That is an incredibly powerful brand in the 21st century. In a world where supply chains are being weaponized, being trusted is a currency in itself. It means investment flows to India not just for cheap labor, but for security and reliability.
So China loses. They must lose some EU sourcing share because of this.
Yes, inevitably. China now faces India as a direct competitor in the EU market, and for the first time in many key sectors, India has a tariff advantage. That is a massive shift in the global trade winds.
And what about India's other neighbors?
ASEAN.
South Asia, how do they fit in?
It's a mix. They gain via India-centric supply chains. If India becomes the main hub for manufacturing for the EU, the neighbors like Bangladesh or Vietnam can supply inputs and components to India. But they also face pressure. If India raises its factory standards to meet EU norms, the neighbors have to raise their standards too if they want to sell into the Indian supply chain.
So it creates a rising tide effect.
It lifts the whole region's quality floor. It creates a gravitational pull towards higher standards throughout South and Southeast Asia.
Let's talk about the implementation timeline. The source says this isn't instant. We aren't flipping a switch today on January 27, 2026.
No, absolutely not. The deal is concluded, but it's not yet law. It still needs to be ratified by the EU Parliament, which can be a rowdy process. Remember the farmers' protests we've seen in Europe?
Right.
And it needs all the legal notifications to be passed in India. The source says full effect takes 2-3 years, so we are in the get ready phase.
Okay, so we're coming to the end of our deep dive. I want to leave our listeners, especially the business owners or professionals who might be listening, with some actionable advice. The source is very direct here. If you are listening to this and you run a business in India, what do you do tomorrow morning?
It's very direct and very practical. Number 1, identify your HS codes.
HS codes. Harmonized system codes. The boring 8-digit numbers that define your entire business life.
Yes, those boring numbers are everything now. The benefits differ at the 8-digit level. You can't just say, I export shoes. You need to know exactly which HS code your specific type of shoe falls under to know if you get a 5% tariff cut or a 10% cut and what the rule of origin is. You have to dig into the data.
The second piece of advice is invest in compliance now, not later.
This is so important. If you wait for your European client to ask you for the environmental certificate, you've already lost the order to a competitor who had it ready. Start the lab testing now. Get your ISO certifications. Upgrade your factory safety standards before the inspector shows up. Be proactive, not reactive.
And the third, which I think is a real mindset shift, is shift from price-based to value-based exports.
That is the whole philosophy of the deal in one sentence. You aren't selling cheap anymore. That's a race to the bottom. You are now selling quality, certified, sustainable, and reliable. That is how you win in Europe. You can't beat everyone on price forever, but you can build a brand based on value.
I love the final provocative thought the source leaves us with. I think it sums this entire thing up perfectly. Countries don't win FTAs. Prepared businesses do.
That just hits home, doesn't it? The government signed the paper, the politicians shook hands, they took the photo op. But the government doesn't export goods. Businesses do. And if the businesses aren't ready to do the homework, to do the hard work of compliance and upgrading, then the deal is just a piece of paper in a drawer in Brussels.
It's not a free lunch. It's an opportunity for those ready to do the work.
Exactly. The source calls it India's most complex trade deal and its most strategic Western partnership. It is a golden ticket, but you still have to pack your own bags and get yourself to the station on time.
Well, there you have it. The 2026 India-EU trade deal. A masterclass in modern geoeconomics, a huge opportunity, wrapped in red tape, delivered with a side of carbon tax, but ultimately a massive step forward for India and the global economy.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's a brave new world for Indian exporters.
Thanks for diving in with us. Now go check those HS codes. Seriously, go check them.
To get to work. We'll see you on the next deep dive.